All right. So as I reflected on today's presentation, it became clear to me that the presentation I planned to give wasn't entirely the right fit, given all that is happening and hurting in our world. I quickly went to a place of, why me? How can I possibly frame a conversation about conflict that will make any sense and not minimize the intense repercussions that conflict has caused our world? And then as I sat in my office on a sunny day with the window cracked open, I heard my neighbor, a friend, and her 3 kids in an all-out screaming throwdown about picking up toys in the yard. The kids were crying, toys were launching through the air. My friend was trying to do that whisper scream, the one where you think no one can hear, but everyone really can hear. And this, of course, was on the heels of my own morning meltdown with my husband, Tom. When out of tiredness, frustration, and intense sadness, I was crying in a fit of anger for people I don't even know. And there may have also been a mention of Tom's poor decision to mow the lawn while I was on a conference call. These moments, big and small, remind me that the topic of conflict is exactly what we need to explore, now more than ever. And not just in theoretical terms, but in basic, real-life, actionable ways. So today, I'll focus on 4 key areas. I'm going to talk about the science behind conflict, our personal conflict style, compassionate curiosity, and then I'll cover some basic techniques we can all start using today. So I took the liberty to rename today's presentation to Brave Conflict, as I hope you'll learn a bit more about how to approach conflict with bravery, compassion, learning, and love. Inspired by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving. And that's what we're going to explore together today, how to keep moving. Maybe you've been asking yourself similar questions to those I'm asking myself. Why me? Why now? Will I make a difference? How can I make a difference? As Craig mentioned, I'm a communications professional, and for the past 20 years, a big part of my job has been helping organizations work through complex issues like corporate downsizings, mergers and acquisitions, bankruptcies. And wow, my personal and professional world has been turned upside down and inside out over the last weeks and months. And I am certain the same goes for you. Regardless of where we work in our job title, no matter our personal situations, we are called on now more than ever to be leaders among our families, our friends, our neighbors, our communities, and in the world. People are looking to each of us to do something, to help us make sense of the hurt, the fighting, the unrest. If you have a pulse, I believe you have an obligation to explore and understand the basics about conflict. Now, if you're still hesitant and unsure, let me explain further. Conflict is a lot of things, and our interpretation of it is most often framed negatively. Conflict is hard, it's invasive, unproductive, it can be hurtful. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I want to challenge you to think about conflict as a simple intersection, a moment when we get to choose. Through my work, I've learned a lot about conflict. And one key learning is that my ability to navigate complex professional situations is only slightly influenced by my education and work experience. Navigating conflict is greatly influenced by the self-awareness and personal experiences I've been developing all of my life. When we know who we are and how we think, and we know our strengths and weaknesses, we can begin to connect with others with vulnerability, courage, and compassion. Seeing conflict in a new way begins inside each of us. There is no formula, no tried and true step-by-step process for tackling every conflict in the world. But I believe we have all the tools we need right in our minds and in our hearts. And like this graphic says, until we fix it in our heart and in our minds and address it at home, nothing changes in the world. Let this be your inspiration to see conflict in a new way. So what is conflict? Seth Godin, who's a writer and marketing genius, offers what I believe to be the simplest and most truthful definition of conflict. He says conflict, he frames it around this idea that one of us is wrong and it's not me. Think for a moment how many times each day we make this assessment. From life-changing circumstances to small details every day. Our minds are constantly firing agreement, disagreement, and our hearts and minds feel joyful or hurt, all for the judging of who is right and who is wrong. I'd like you to take a moment and think about a conflict you're currently navigating. It could be a personal or professional matter. Maybe it's something you've tried to address in the past, but things didn't go as well as you would have liked. Maybe it's something that has been escalated during COVID-19, a political debate, an injustice, or hurtful disagreement with a friend or a colleague. I want you to keep this conflict in mind as we take a look inside ourselves and begin to understand our individual conflict point of view. Next up, I want to share a bit about the science and biology behind our individual conflict response. This is your amygdala. Now, some of you might know this, but I remember when I first learned this, it was like an aha moment. The amygdala is a temperamental part of the brain that is quick to respond to perceived threats. It's part of the limbic system, also known as the lizard brain, and it's one of the most primitive brain structures. These quick primal responses were critical back in the day when we were living in caves and death literally lurked around every corner. The problem is that society evolved faster than our brains, and as a result, today we struggle in difficult situations because we're fighting modern day problems with primitive tools. Have you ever said something in the heat of the moment that you immediately knew was a mistake? It happens, right? These quick responses are called an amygdala hijack. And it takes us from rational to irrational in the blink of an eye. Think about our own quick responses to changing circumstances. See what is happening in our world and in our own communities. These quick responses, while they're biological, are indulgent in entitlement, instant gratification from swift, unthinking responses. We all have them. And these quick responses, well, they're rooted in fear, and we only have 3 fear responses: fight, flight, or freeze. Our fear responses can shift based on circumstances and relationships, but most of us are inclined toward one kind of fear response. And this instinctive fear response is most likely a product of our lived experience. Previously, I mentioned that our fear response is likely a product of our lived experience. Well, this is me. This is a picture of me at 5 years old, right? I was super shy, very timid. I grew up on a farm in rural Cold Spring as the 7th of 8 kids. And living in a rural community, our closest neighbors were several miles away. Maybe some of you can relate to this. So my siblings and I spent a lot of time together at home. And with 8 kids and 2 adults, our house was a constant churn of work and chaos. There's a lot of fighting between my siblings and I that often ended with tears, slammed doors, the silent treatment, and sometimes our parents had to physically separate us. And at times, my conflict response was to fight. This was an effective way of getting what I wanted, holding my own or taking a stand amidst the chaos. But most of the time, my conflict response was flight or freeze. This was part survival tactic, being one of the youngest in the family, but it also is my instinctive fear response. And I know this because at a young age, I remember how difficult it was to see people hurting or fighting with one another. I was often known among first my siblings and then in school as someone who was sensitive. Among my siblings, I was known as the crier, and I often preferred to be alone. And the other thing about our amygdala is that it doesn't just fire these fear responses. It stores memories of events and emotions so that we recognize similar events in the future. If you know someone or if you've ever suffered a dog bite, you know how that builds to your fear of dogs. And you know the saying, forgive and forget? Well, our amygdala makes this really difficult as it's constantly operating in our defense on a physical and emotional level. And now that you know this and can apply it to yourselves, I encourage you to think about how the people in your life, in our world, are protecting themselves. The weak feel more compromised. The weary more tired and worn. The vulnerable exploited. I believe we each conflict story with these early fear responses and experiences. I've thought a lot about this, and what I've come to determine is that my conflict story centers around the belief that in the face of conflict, the loudest, most powerful authority wins. There is a clear winner and a clear loser, and conflict hurts, both physically and emotionally. This is what I learned back living with my siblings and my big family. Our conflict story is stored in our hearts and in our minds, and it stands ready to write the narrative about any and all conflict situations. And this applies to our personal and professional lives. I'd like you to think about your earliest memories of conflict. What did you believe conflict was and how it worked? What actions did you associate with conflict? How did you recall people treating one another during conflict moments? What do you believe is your natural or instinctive fear response? In my experiences, I have found that we can align behaviors with our fear responses, and if, just like most things in life, there are positives and negatives to each of these. First, we'll address the fight response. If you have a tendency toward a fight response, you may be quick to take action or voice an opposing view as absolutely, positively right. That's the amygdala hijack we mentioned earlier. The downside to the fight response is that an emotion-filled response can kill creativity and persuade others before they have thoughtfully had an opportunity to discern their own point of views. Now, the plus side of a fight response suggests an openness and bravery to share one's thoughts in a persuasive way. Monitoring our instinctive fear response, and even better, creating better and new outcomes can sometimes happen when we employ an alternative response. But we can only do this if we know what our instinctive fear response is. Then we can call on the other fear responses. So if you feel a fight response coming on, you might pause for a moment, even a few seconds, and remind ourselves to cease fire and let the situation sit, even if it means silence in a room. You can go for a walk. You can ask for time to think about the situation and follow up later. Flight responses include removing yourself from the situation, either temporarily or altogether. Those of us at flight risk are sometimes hesitant to take a position or share our thoughts openly. The downside to this response is that conflicts can be stalled or avoided altogether. And we may be viewed as indecisive or weak, especially in those moments. Now, the plus side to a flight response is that we can gain clarity after we take time to collect our thoughts. But be careful to not fall victim to your instinct and pounce away from the situation before you've articulated your proposed options. If you've ever been in a relationship or you lived with someone who has a tendency to adopt the flight response, you know what it's like talking to someone who immediately turns around and walks away and might not say a word about it. It feels pretty bad in those moments. It can be helpful to seek someone else's point of view also of the situation. And what I found as a communications professional is don't assume that people know what you're going to do, that you are seeking someone's point of view. Actually use the words and say, you know, I'm not prepared at this moment to address this issue. I'd like some time and I'll come back later with some solutions. The freeze response is also known as the deer in the headlights response, as it often means we freeze on the scene, sometimes physically and or emotionally. We become paralyzed to speak or take action. The freeze response is real, and it can sometimes cause our colleagues and family members to feel completely abandoned. But you can rebound with thoughtful ideas at a later time, much like a flight response. If you feel a freeze response coming on, try to stay in the moment by asking a question. Make an observation or restate the situation as you saw it. Ask for clarity. And that's just one example of, again, knowing what your fear response is and reaching for another fear response to counter that. So the idea is that as leaders, this enlightenment of our own and others' fear responses is the first step to seeing conflict in a new way. This understanding allows us to adjust our approach and to coach others to adjust their approach. And I cannot stress enough the importance of working on yourself as it relates to exploring and understanding conflict. Back to our beliefs. Most of us are raised to believe that conflict is a bad thing. And we spend most of our lives acting out our fear responses, living in a world of instant gratification, unaware of our own impact and the consequences we create for others. I've worked in higher education for more than a decade, and I can assure you that most kids and young adults, and many of us adults, do not gain these skills of self-awareness, but we expect people to figure it out on their own, and then we're frustrated when they can't simply do as we do to fit in. And that's not really the point anyway. We have to stop thinking and believing that conflict is something that happens to us, and understand that we can and must influence our thinking about conflict and see it as an opportunity. So earlier we acknowledged that fight, flight, and freeze are primitive responses to conflict. Facing conflict constructively with an eye toward positive change and breakthroughs requires a more evolved response. It requires something I like to call compassionate curiosity. Brené Brown is one of my favorite authors, and she reminds us that people are hard to hate close up. Move in. I just love that. It's so powerful. Compassionate curiosity requires us to get close to the situation, and more importantly, to build deeper relationships. Now, the distinction between curiosity and compassionate curiosity is more than just semantics. So, for example, I could start a conversation with, "What the heck were you thinking?" Curious? Yes. Compassionate? Not so much. Or I could start a conversation with, "How do you feel about the situation?" Compassionate curiosity fosters a genuine desire to understand that is rooted in empathy and respect. And approaching conversations in this way naturally causes us to ask better and deeper questions and to listen more effectively. What makes this so hard is the fact that we need to be vulnerable. And this is the courage to show up even when we can't predict the outcome. We must put aside our own agenda to tell our story and to get what we want. We have to put our opinions aside on the matter as well. We need to be willing to suspend judgment and open ourselves to the scary possibilities that we might be wrong. Or even harder, that we might lose a relationship. I've been facilitating a lot of conversations recently about COVID-19 planning and responses for various organizations. And as we talked about earlier, most of us have never experienced a pandemic before. So I think it's safe to say that most of us don't have a plan we can pull off a shelf and quickly implement, right? Now, in one particular meeting I was leading, the group was clearly divided on next steps. And the conversation was escalating and voices were getting louder and louder. At one point, a particular, very vocal gentleman in the room slammed his hand on the table, looked directly at me and said, "Would you make a decision already?" And of course, it took me off guard. I actually even physically sort of stepped back and moved away from the table. But there was my intersection. That moment, those split seconds where I had a choice. I could bark back a response or stammer to quickly make a decision, or I could ask questions to learn more. So I asked him, what is the point of rushing a decision? What benefits do you think that will yield? So he couldn't answer the questions. The room was quiet, and we eventually continued to weigh our options. Now, I believe that gentleman said what most of us in the room were thinking. He just happened to be the one who acted on his fight response. Or through another lens, he happened to be the person who presented me with the opportunity to exercise compassionate curiosity. So when we slow down and ask these high-level questions, this forces us to use the most evolved part of our brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is where we find logical reasoning. Whenever we get lost, confused, or scared in these conversations, compassionate curiosity can be our North Star. We can look to it for guidance when we don't know what to say. We can lean on it for support in the most difficult conversations. The key to engaging this is almost always the ability to pause. And when you're the one leading the meeting or directing the conversation, boy, those pauses feel like they're so long. I can assure you, when I'm a participant in meetings, those pauses aren't too long for the room. But as you start to build this new habit, you'll realize that exercising compassionate curiosity and asking questions actually takes pressure off of us, because the goal is to learn and not judge. We don't have to worry so much about getting our way or moving our agenda forward. There isn't a focus on solely being right and who is wrong. You don't need to be a professional communicator to practice compassionate curiosity. It works in our personal lives as well, but I'm a lot better at doing this in my professional life than I am in my personal life. And this is because that as the relationships get closer, the stakes get higher. There is more to lose. But we have to remember, we don't use compassionate curiosity because it's easy, right? We use it because the relationship is worth it. We use it because we want to show our investment in moving the person, the situation, the organization, the family, the cause forward. A friend of mine says, when I am angry, there's something I don't know. And I love this because I think it's such a great way to think about our fear responses and to retrain our brain to instinctively move to compassionate curiosity. In that statement, anger is the fight response. We could also say, when I want to run away or take flight, there is something I don't know. When I don't know what to say or do, the freeze response. There is something I don't know. This is where compassionate curiosity comes into play. So, how do we take all of this knowledge and leverage it to see conflict in a new way? Here are a few ideas. We focus on self-exploration, and we can reflect on these statements to help us understand where we're currently at. So until you fix it in your heart and in your minds, I like to think and reflect on these statements. So my instinctive fear response can be an asset when others can teach me how to. My greatest strength in facing conflict is. I find these types of reflections and I encourage helpful, and I encourage you to actually write out your responses to these questions. Because the more you think about it, the more you write about it, the more you can call on these gifts that you have. And you see how I purposefully focused on strengths. There is no one book or manual about how to manage and deal with conflict. We have to consider our learnings, our past, and until we do that, we can't consider the learnings of others and others' past experiences. You can focus on those personal gifts and gratitude to understand. Then after you think about it in your own world, how do you address it in your home? How do you extend what you know about yourself and what you're fearful of and what your responses in fear are? Well, now we can help others see their fear responses and help uncover really what's at the center of their world by exploring things like, I can teach others to, I give thanks and gratitude by, and these can be words, these can be actions. I can help my family, and you might even say, I can help my family in times of stress by, and really commit to doing this, commit to owning this perspective. This will help you refine your lens on the world with a focus on learning and expanding our thinking. When we want to apply this idea of conflict management and retraining our brain, think about it through a world lens. What are you curious about learning? I'm curious to learn. I desire to serve. Who, where, how? I know that I make an impact in my community when. And a great part of this is that these are all framed in our strengths and our gifts. There's nothing here that says this is the right way to deal with conflict and this is the wrong way to deal with conflict. What I know is that we are all a work in progress. And these are most certainly trying and very strange times. But don't for a minute give up or give in to the temptations to spew our vulnerabilities on others in our world. That's really what our fear responses are. Yes, they're there to protect us, but they can also limit our potential to see people, to know people, and to learn new things by exercising compassionate curiosity. In the confines of COVID-19, our world can feel strangely small and tight, and big and untouchable at the same time. I hope that what you learned today allows you to look both inward and get to know more about you and how you're managing today, but also to look outward and to see a world of possibilities. Too much emphasis inside ourselves can create isolation, loneliness, and closed-mindedness. We have to remember to exercise learning in all three areas of inward self, home, and our worldview. The conflicts in our homes and at work, in our communities, and in our world requires compassionate curiosity that is built from the not knowing. It's built from the vulnerability that each of us has. But when we combine that with listening and learning, we can build deeper relationships with one another. Consider today a place to start. But by being here today, you've already taken the first step, and you're farther along than many, many other people. So I'm so grateful to each of you for being here. And I'm always looking for additional resources and information on conflict. And I just got this promotional email this week from the Harvard Business Review, who I think is a really wonderful resource and provides a lot of great content and instruction. So if you're interested in learning more, you might want to check out this offer. It includes a book, a presentation, and a study guide. And I think it can be a helpful way to spark conversation with our colleagues, our families, and our friends. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to our discussion. So if you've got questions, I will certainly take those questions. I'm going to get back into, stop sharing my screen here so we can have a conversation.
Well, first of all, Tammy, thank you. And everybody unmute your line because I think that deserves a very big round of applause. Great presentation, and I can tell you from me personally that hits home and makes total sense. So I'm going to open it up to some questions here, and let's have a discussion.
This is Sister Nina, and as you were talking, Tammy, I thought of something. Sometimes I've recognized that if I start to ask a question, then people might say that I'm dodging the issue. In other words, you know, asking a question of them, I'm not answering what they're wanting to know about myself. Do you have any comments or any insight on how we can gently still do that without seeming like we are being what do I want to say, hard on that person or accusing that person of something?
Yeah, I have also experienced that, Sister Nina. And one thing I try to remind myself in those situations is that asking questions is counterintuitive. Especially as leaders, a lot of us find ourselves in situations, especially recently, when there are no clear answers, that people want us to make decisions and to maybe display that we have a concrete answer. And so I would say that in those moments when I've experienced what you're describing, it is uncomfortable. It can be very uncomfortable to be the one asking questions. But mostly I just remind myself that the question asking and the seeking of people's input is very counterintuitive to our world, and we love wanting answers, and we love knowing that there are rights and wrongs. And so my suggestion would be to keep asking questions, and if we can, become more comfortable with the discomfort. Because I think the only way to get to solution and resolution is to ask those questions. And certainly questions can also be a way to engage others in conversation. I think so many of us are in relationships with our coworkers and colleagues, just as one example, where some people who are more comfortable sharing ideas are more forthright and more vocal in different situations. But asking questions can be a really great way to engage and ensure that everyone has a voice at the table. So I would encourage you to keep doing it, even though it feels uncomfortable. So Craig, you asked a question here. What are some constructive ways we can train our body/brain responses to step back when you come into a situation similar to the example I gave of the gentleman slamming his fist on the table? So I believe in muscle memory, and your brain is a muscle. And so habit, just try to build a habit. And at first it's going to feel very forced. or can feel very forced in those situations. And also remember that someone who is a fighter, what do they want? They want you to fight back. And if you don't give them, if you don't indulge them in fighting back, but you give them something calm and reflective and another perspective, I think it changes the dynamic of the room. And in every situation that I've had in my professional and personal life, when I have met a fighter with fight, the situation never ends well. We never get to a place of resolution, but when a fighter can be met with someone who can verbalize and request more time to think about it, can ask questions about why do you think that way, automatically when you ask questions, that fighter, it's like you can almost see their blood pressure coming down. It actually has a way of physically and emotionally diffusing and bringing down the temperature of the conversation.
Tammy, do you feel that that's the same for the other two, the flight and the freeze? If you meet them with the same type of response, it will redirect.
Absolutely. So my husband is classic flight, but also freeze. And so imagine when the two of us are together and I want to freeze also, and he's frozen, nothing happens. We don't ever move forward because we're both sort of paralyzed in the situation. And the same goes when, and just again, using my husband as an example, what happens when two people just walk away from the situation? Nothing good comes out of that. You know, you both stomp away and you're not moving to a resolution. Now, also my fight response can kick in sometimes with my husband. So when he, walks away from a situation, I'm ready to go. I want to talk about it. I want to resolve it now. And that's not always welcome either. So you have to be careful, I think. And that's why I love the idea and utilize a lot the notion of compassionate curiosity, because if you're genuinely using and authentically leveraging compassionate curiosity, it comes from a place of goodness. It comes from a place of genuinely wanting to learn and to be empathetic to that person. But to answer your question, I do think when flight is met with flight, it doesn't resolve things. The same goes for fight and freeze as well. So Becky, do I have any suggestions for dealing with remote conflict resolution given our current situation? I'm so glad you asked this question. So one thing that I've noticed in a lot of us working from home and not being able to be in the same room, one thing that I really miss is we miss the opportunity to read body language. And, we only see people from the neck up. You can't see, are they wringing their hands? Are they sort of repositioning? Are they getting really uncomfortable, sitting there? So it's hard to judge people. So again, what I try to do is to ask questions. How do you feel about the response I just provided? Did it meet your needs? Did it answer your question? And I would also say, never leave a meeting, never click end meeting if there's still something that needs to be discussed. Even if it's to say, I'm going to schedule another meeting so that we can come back to this topic, and you can expect that invitation from me by the end of the day or whatever. I think it's just really helpful to let people know, to communicate our expectations and the next steps forward. And it's hard because I think every person probably on this call finds that sometimes you're in the driver's seat and sometimes you're on the receiving end. But I believe that being a leader is being the person who goes into these difficult conversations with a willingness and desire to learn and with eyes wide open. That's what people need from us as leaders.
Thank you. That makes sense.
So Joseph asks, what do you do when an issue is discussed multiple times but needed changes are not made? So I think Boy, that happens a lot, doesn't it? So I think in thinking about, I'll just kind of relate that question back to conflict. To me, that might indicate that there is a bigger issue or something at a level of detail that maybe isn't being addressed. So again, I would counter that or approach that with more questions like, is there something here? Is there something more to the situation that I don't know? Is there something more that I can do to help the situation? Do you have alternative expectations for what a good outcome might be? Just asking those broad questions. You know, when we are talking, especially via Zoom, boy, it's like next level surface conversations, right? So we have to be really careful and monitor our words, I think, more carefully than ever. And so asking more questions. And one thing that I do, if I anticipate going into a difficult conversation, I write down questions in advance. And I try to arm myself with general questions because I know my fear responses. I know that I will want to resist moving through the conversation. So I find great strength from those questions, and it's kind of a safety blanket or a safety net there for me if I write them out in advance. And I also think people really appreciate being asked. So I think leveraging questions, but asking questions that get at that level of detail, Joseph, that I think you're wanting. You might have to shift the questions that you're asking.
All right. Well, does anyone else have any other questions at this time? I don't think I see any more in the chat box. Are we missing any, Tammy?
No, I'm not seeing any more either.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for attending. Tammy, that was fantastic. We all really appreciate it, and I think it's a piece that each of us can use individually. I know I'm going to be able to.